Hi, folks. Welcome back to our fourth video in this series on the Bill of Rights. And in this video, we will be looking at the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, and the Seventh Amendment. Now, the Seventh Amendment will probably take me under a minute to explain, but the Fifth and Sixth Amendments are quite complicated. There's a lot going on here, particularly here, as you can see with the Fifth Amendment. And I do not need you to preview this amendment. We're just going to jump right in and start talking about it. I have included on the screen a list of the various the bulleted points that we're going to talk about with this amendment. And we're going to start by talking about something called due process of law. Now, something to understand here with the Fifth and the Sixth Amendments is that a lot of this involves what is termed the rights of the accused. A lot of what's going on in the Fifth and the Sixth Amendment involves your rights under the law, especially if you are arrested or put on trial for a crime. And this legal term, due process of law, which appears in the Fifth Amendment, is actually, it's not as complicated as it sounds.
Wait a minute. You're always saying things like, it's not complicated. Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm sure. I got this. Due process of law simply means that the government has to follow the law too. They can't just throw you in jail, ignore your rights, and take away your stuff. If they want to put you in jail, they have to arrest you. They have to provide some evidence that you committed a crime. They have to put you on trial, which is going to involve courts and judges and all of the legal rules that go along with that. So, due process of law, the government has to follow the same rules and the same procedures as you and I if they want to take action against you. So now we can check off those last two bullets. The first bullet, grand juries, I want to wait to talk about that until we get to the Sixth Amendment, because a grand jury is a type of trial, a special type of trial, and it's going to fit in better when we look at the Sixth Amendment, which is really all about trials. So let's wait to talk about that one. And we'll move into double jeopardy and the right to remain silent. With these rights of the accused, let me start by saying I am not a lawyer, but I've seen a lot of Law and Order episodes, so I will try to explain these to you as best as I can. But if you ever get in trouble with the law, don't call me. Just try to remember your Fifth and Sixth Amendments. Starting with what we call the Double Jeopardy Clause. Yeah, not this Jeopardy. Although the game show Jeopardy did get its name from this clause in the Fifth Amendment, where it says that a person should not be put twice in jeopardy of life or limb. Jeopardy refers to a risk. That's what that word means, to put something to risk. And that should make sense if you've ever seen the game Jeopardy. When people go for double jeopardy, they're risking the money they have trying to get more. But the risk that we're talking about here is being put on trial. So to be put twice in jeopardy of life or limb is referring to the idea that the police, without this amendment, could just keep putting you on trial for the same crime over and over and over again until they get the guilty verdict that they're looking for. But luckily, with the Fifth Amendment, that cannot happen. So the Fifth Amendment is saying that you cannot be put on trial two times for the same crime. If you are found not guilty in trial, you can literally walk out of the courthouse and announce to the world that you did it, and the police cannot touch you. And the same would apply if you're found not guilty, and then later on the police find some new evidence that proves that you did do it. They still cannot put you on trial. So that is why the police try to do a very thorough job and get as much evidence as possible before they actually arrest you and put you on trial, because they really only get one shot at it. But the opposite of this is not true. In other words, if you are found guilty of a crime, you can ask for a second trial and possibly be found not guilty. So, no double jeopardy is referring to situations where a person is found not guilty. There is no second trial. Once you're found not guilty, you are not guilty forever. Now, moving on to everybody's favorite right, the right to remain silent, also known as the keep your mouth shut clause, sometimes referred to as I plead the fifth. And what this part of the Fifth Amendment says is that you cannot be forced to testify against yourself in court. So if you are brought into court, you are put on trial, they cannot force you to take the witness stand and answer questions. And one of the reasons why this is included in the Fifth Amendment is if you can imagine a person who is charged with a crime, if they were forced to go up on the witness stand, what would be the first question that would be asked? Of course, did you do it? Now, if the person on trial says, no, I didn't do it, but they really did do it, then there's a problem, because if they're found guilty of the crime, they are now going to be found guilty of a second crime. And that crime is perjury, which means lying under oath in court. If they did commit the crime and they say yes, well, of course, then they're instantly found guilty. So one of the reasons why this is included in the Fifth Amendment is to prevent people from being put into that situation. If they are charged with a crime, they simply do not have to testify at all. And in fact, your lawyer in that situation is going to tell you not to testify 99.9999% of the time. Lawyers will tell people, do not get up on the witness stand. Simply do not testify. Now, this also applies to questions from the police. That is why the police say what they do when they arrest you. You have the right to remain silent. You do not have to answer police questions. The police cannot beat a confession out of you. And in that situation, when you're placed under arrest, the first thing you're probably going to do is call a lawyer. Next up, we have the Sixth Amendment, continuing with our rights of the accused. And this amendment is really all about trials and trial by jury, which we'll talk about in a minute, and includes the right to be told what crime you are being charged with, the right to interview witnesses that are called against you and ask them questions, and the right to call your own witnesses during your trial in your defense. And of course, the right to an attorney, which means the right to have a lawyer. So we're going to look a little bit closer at juries. Let's move on to the next slide here. So in America, you can have two different kinds of trials. You can have what's called a bench trial, or you can have a trial by jury. And most people will choose to have trial by jury because that is their right under the Sixth Amendment. But it is possible to have a trial where the judge decides. In most cases, though, the judge is not there to decide whether the person is guilty or not guilty. In a bench trial, they are, but since most people choose a jury trial, the judge is really only there as a referee. He's there to make sure that the lawyers for both sides are following the proper rules of the courtroom and the rules of law. So juries are made up of ordinary people who come to the courthouse, they listen to the evidence, and they decide the court case. Juries are made up of 6 to 12 jurors, so there are 6 to 12 people that decide the court case. That can change from state to state. And the verdict, when the jury makes this decision, it has to be unanimous. So it cannot be 9 people vote guilty, 3 people vote not guilty, therefore the person is guilty. Nope. All 12 jurors would have to vote for the person to be guilty. If not, they start over again with a brand new trial with brand new jurors. And if that happens enough times, then the person simply goes free, because in that case it's clear there's not enough evidence to convict them beyond the shadow of a doubt. And everybody serves on a jury. Eventually, all of you will be called to jury duty. So that's something I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about, because it is something that's going to affect you eventually. And I wanted to give you some details about what it was like for me. I've been called to jury duty twice. Once I served on a trial, and the second time I was dismissed. They didn't like me as a juror, apparently. And that sometimes happens. So when you get called to jury duty, you'll get a letter in the mail, and the letter will give you a number, and it will say, call this phone number on Sunday night, and you will have a juror number assigned to you. So let's say that you are assigned juror number 77, and you follow the directions and you call the phone number. And Sunday night, you might get a message. It's usually a message, always a message, really. And the message might say, okay, jurors number 1 through 60, please report to the county courthouse in Rochester at 8 a.m. Monday morning. Well, you are juror number 77. Therefore, you don't have to go in for jury duty on Monday, but you will have to call again on Monday night. So then you call again on Monday night, and you get another message, and the message says jurors number 61 through 102 must report to the county courthouse at Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. Well, now that your number has come up, you've been summoned to jury duty, and you must go. If you ignore jury duty, it is a crime. They can actually put you in jail for it. So don't try to avoid it. Not only is it a crime to avoid jury duty, it's your civic duty to show up. It's your responsibility as a citizen. And what I'd like to say to people is, if you were put on trial for your life, or put on trial for a serious crime that you didn't commit, wouldn't you want 12 honest people to take the time out of their schedule to listen to your side of the story? I mean, without jury duty, our justice system doesn't work in America. So I would really encourage you, because you can always tell when you get to jury duty, there's those people who try to avoid it. I think it was my sister told me one time, she went in and said, when they're asking her questions, she said, I'm sure he did it. If the police arrested him, that's enough for me. Well, they didn't pick her because they didn't think that she was going to be an impartial juror. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I want to explain how the process works when you get called in. But I just want to underscore the fact that this is a big responsibility. It's an important responsibility, and I hope that you guys take it seriously when you do get called. And it's actually pretty interesting, I think. At least the times that I was called, I learned a lot. So you'll go to the courthouse. You'll show up there. There's going to be a whole bunch of people there. Many people, dozens and dozens of people. And what they'll do is they'll start peeling people off in groups of, say, 20 or 30. And they'll bring you into the courtroom. And the judge will be there, and the lawyers will be there. And at that point, they're going to start going through a process trying to choose people for the jury. So there might be 30 potential jurors pulled into the courtroom, but they're only going to pick 12 or 13, because sometimes they usually pick an alternate just in case one of the jurors gets sick. So in my case, the first jury that I was summoned to turned out to be not a criminal case, but what we call a civil case, where someone was being sued. And the situation was, this guy had been riding his bike, and he had got into an accident. A woman had turned in front of him with her van, and he had hit the side of the van, and unfortunately he had been killed. So the woman was being sued by the man's family. So when we went into the courtroom, they started calling us up one by one to sit in the witness box, and then they ask you questions. Both lawyers ask you questions. And the kind of questions they asked me was, do you ride a bike? Do you believe bikes and bicyclists belong on the road? Have you ever been involved in a car accident with a bicycle? And questions like that, because they want to make sure that they have someone who can judge the case fairly. And they also want to know if you know the people involved. In the second case that I served on, actually didn't serve, but I was in the jury pool. And when they were calling people up to the witness stand, the the last question they usually ask you is there any reason that you believe you would not be able to judge this case fairly? And the one woman, they asked her a bunch of questions, and then at the end they said, do you think you can judge the case fairly? And she said, listen, that murder happened right on my street, and I knew the person involved. And as soon as she said that, they dismissed her because they do not want anyone to serve on the jury who knows anything specific about the case or knows anything about the people involved. So they will start to weed out people until they get 12 that they feel will judge the case fairly. And in my case, my situation, I was chosen as one of those 12 people. And we listened to 2 or 3 days of testimony. And then actually, to me, it was a little bit disappointing because I had sort of made up my mind about how much money I felt the family should be awarded and whether or not I felt the woman was guilty. I listened to all the facts and I had made that decision in my mind. But then, of course, the last day or the last step is all the jurors go and they discuss the case in private and they try to get that unanimous verdict. Well, when we showed up for the final day of the trial, once all the evidence had been presented, we got into the courtroom and there was nobody there except the judge. And I immediately knew something was up. And the judge said, listen, the insurance company has just settled with the family. They agreed to pay a certain amount of money. And so they've dropped the lawsuit and the case is dismissed. So I went through all that and I never actually got to be part of a verdict. But what I did go through, it was quite sad listening to the facts of that case. But it was interesting to see how the process works. And then, as I said, the second time I was called to jury duty, it was for a murder trial. It was in the summertime. I was a teacher. By then, I was teaching. And I didn't get chosen, and I'm not sure why. They chose their 12, and I was one of the people who just didn't happen to be chosen for that case. So jury duty, very important. Something that everybody is going to be a part of. You will all be called to jury duty eventually, and when you do, I hope that you participate responsibly and take it seriously, because without juries, we can't have a fair criminal justice system unless we have people who are willing to listen to the facts of the case. Here are some commonly asked questions about jury duty I'd just like to answer. Do you get paid for jury duty? Well, technically, yes. Technically, you get paid $40 a day. If you are employed, your boss has to pay that. Your boss also has to let you go to jury duty. Your boss can't say, you got to work today. You can't go to jury duty. Nope, they have to allow you to. That is required by the law. But nobody's going to get rich off of jury duty. If you are lucky, and for example, a teacher, I am one of those people. If I have jury duty, I get my full pay. My employer does pay my paycheck to attend jury duty. Some businesses do that. Some businesses will only pay the minimum $40. Now, what if you can't go? Well, short answer is you have to go. There are extreme circumstances. Of course, there's always exceptions to everything. If you have open heart surgery scheduled, if you get notice for jury duty and it happens to fall on the day of the wedding that you've planned for the past 6 months, there's a potential that they could defer it for you, which means they could put it off. But you would have to call a number, and I believe that number is on the letter that you get. And it's very infrequently, very rare that they're going to say, oh, okay, we understand that you can't make it. No, at the very best, what they're going to be able to do for you is defer it so that the next time they send out letters, you'll get another letter maybe a couple months later asking you to attend jury duty. But for most situations, I'm busy, I just don't feel like it, I've got a vacation planned, is not going to get you out of jury duty. And as I mentioned earlier, it is the law that you report, so you can get into quite a bit of trouble if you don't go. How often do you get called? I believe that when you serve on a jury, in most juries, or even just getting called to jury duty, so even if you get called but you're not picked to serve on the jury, that's still considered you fulfilled your requirement for jury duty. Once you fulfill that requirement, once you show up at the courthouse and go through that process, I think it takes your name out of the jury pool for about 8 years. So on average, I'd say most people get called every 8 to 10, maybe 12 years. Right now I'm in my 40s and I've been called twice. So that averages out a little over every 10 years, at least in my situation. Okay, grand juries, the last thing I'm going to talk about here with the Sixth Amendment. This is actually Fifth Amendment stuff, but remember I said I wanted to talk about it when we got into juries, because a grand jury is sort of a trial. It's like a trial before the trial. It's a quick trial where the police bring in the evidence, they present it to a jury to decide not if the person is guilty or not, but to decide if they should even be charged with a crime to begin with. And the reason we have grand juries is, let's say that there's a police officer in your neighborhood and he doesn't like you. And so he decides he's going to make your life difficult. He's going to arrest you for a crime, even though there's no evidence that you committed the crime. And he knows that, but he also knows that just by arresting you and putting you on trial, he's creating a big hassle for you. You're going to have to pay for a lawyer. You're going to have to show up for the trial. Your reputation is probably going to be tarnished because even if you're found not guilty, you were put on trial for it. So just being put on trial is such a big deal and can have such negative consequences for people that the Bill of Rights includes this thing about grand juries where instead of having the police decide if you should be put on trial, they have a group of impartial jurors look at the evidence and decide if you should be put on trial. Grand juries are really short compared to jury trials can last for days. Grand juries, if you go in for grand jury duty, you might look at 3, 4, 5 cases in a day where you're just quick scanning the evidence and saying, okay, looks like there's enough here to put the person on trial. So a grand jury is a trial before the trial to decide if a person should be put on trial. And I hope that's not confusing for you, but that's the best way that I can explain it. No discussion of the Fifth and Sixth Amendments would be complete without talking about this guy, Ernesto Miranda. And some of you may have already heard this term. Your Miranda rights are the rights that the police read to you when you're arrested. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. Well, there's a whole story behind this. Ernesto Miranda was arrested in 1963 for a pretty awful crime. He kidnapped and abused an 18-year-old woman. So he gets arrested and they bring him down to the police station and they start questioning him. And after about 2 hours, he breaks down and he confesses. He says, I did it. So he's charged with a crime. They put him on trial and he's found guilty. But during his trial, his lawyer tried this sort of clever defense. His lawyer said, listen, my client didn't know that he had a right under the Fifth Amendment to remain silent. So when the police were questioning him, he thought he had to confess. And as a result, his lawyer said his confession should not be allowed to be used as evidence because the police did not respect his right to remain silent. Well, as I said, he was found guilty anyways, but this is a perfect situation for a lawyer to appeal a verdict. Lawyers, defendants with the help of a lawyer have the option, if they're found guilty, to ask a higher court to look at their case again and possibly get a new trial if they can argue that something was bad about their first trial, that something went wrong during their first trial, particularly if they can convince a judge that the person's rights were not respected during that trial. So Miranda's lawyer was able to convince a higher court to look at his case again. And that's sort of how this whole process works. You jump from one court to the next court to the next court until you get to the very highest court, which is the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court chose to listen to his case. They heard the facts and they threw his guilty verdict out. They said, listen, if a person is arrested, the police need to inform them of their rights. Now, prior to this, before this, the police didn't necessarily do this. But with the Supreme Court decision in 1966, that basically told the police that from this point on, if you don't read someone their rights, then there's a good chance that they're not going to be found guilty, because the evidence that you gather, especially if they confess, you're not going to be able to use it in court. So from this point on, this is where the police started to read people their rights, known as the Miranda rights: the right to remain silent, Fifth Amendment; the right to an attorney, Sixth Amendment. So let's take a look at how this story ended, which is somewhat humorous, not exactly humorous, but a lot of times if I'm teaching this in the classroom, kids will ask me, well, did he do it? Well, yeah, it kind of looks like he did, because when he was released, they put him on trial again. Now, double jeopardy did not apply here. They didn't find him not guilty. They just said, we're going to let you go because there was something bad about your trial. If the police want to rearrest you and use different evidence that doesn't involve your confession, they're free to do that. So that's what the police did. They went out, they got some other evidence, and they said, well, we're just going to put you on trial again. And the evidence that they used included a witness who testified that Miranda told her he did it. So this guy clearly had a problem with keeping his mouth shut. And he was convicted in 1967. He went to jail for a few years. And when he got out of jail, a lot of people don't know this part of the story. He actually went back to his old neighborhood and made a living autographing the Miranda cards that police officers were now required to carry around with them. You know, when they're reading when they're reading a person their rights, they read it right off one of these Miranda cards. So he would autograph the cards and get money for that. Until 1976, when he was stabbed to death during an argument. The suspect was arrested, but unlike Miranda, he chose to keep his mouth shut, and so with no evidence against him, the police had to release him. And as far as I know, the Miranda murder case was never solved. But thanks to Miranda, you will have your rights read to you by the police, so that there is never a question when you come to trial of whether or not you knew that you had the right to remain silent. One last thing I want to mention before we move on to the Seventh Amendment, and that's the idea that you're innocent until proven guilty. I'm sure a lot of you have heard that term before, and I think it says a lot about our system of justice in America. You might have noticed already that a lot of the rights and protections under the Fifth and the Sixth Amendment really favor the person who's accused. And I think the idea here is that it's better to live under a system where guilty people occasionally go free than a system where innocent people go to jail. We see examples of this with your Miranda rights, the fact that even if a person is found guilty, they can appeal the verdict and possibly get a second trial. And jury trials where all the jurors have to agree, because if there's even a shadow of a doubt, we let the person go free. It's not a perfect system, but it's a system where everybody's rights under the Constitution are protected by the law. Okay, I promised you guys I was going to cover the Seventh Amendment in under a minute, so let's start the clock and go. Seventh Amendment says you have the right to a trial by jury, not just in a criminal court, but in a civil court as well. What's the difference between a criminal court and a civil court? In a criminal court, you're being charged with a crime. In a civil court, you're being sued because someone says you either owe them money or you took away their rights. My advice, follow the law. Be nice to people and stay out of court altogether. The end.